Welcome back everyone to this lecture on using functions with logic. We already know a lot of logic statements within Python, things like for loops and while loops, if statements and else statements, and so on. So what we're going to do is to begin combine that knowledge with the ability of a function. So let's get started. We're going to start off with a very simple function that just checks whether or not a single number is even, and we'll expand the complexity from there. Let me head back to the Jupyter Notebook. Alright, here I am in the Jupyter Notebook. I want to do a quick recall about the mod operator, which essentially returns the remainder after a division, which means if the mod operator is end up equals to 0, then the number is evenly divisible by whatever the mod operation was. So to give you an example of this, if I were to say 2 mod 2 and run this, then the result is 0, because 2 divided by 2 is 1, remainder 0. If I were to say 3 mod 2, then 3 divided by 2, 2 goes in once into 3, and then there's a remainder of 1. So recall that this mod operator just returns back the remainder after division. So for example, if I were to say 41 mod 40, take a second to figure this out, basically it should be remainder 1. Since 40 can go into 41 one full time with a remainder of 1. Okay, so how can we use this to check if a number is even? Well, if a number is even, such as 20, then I know that that number, mod 2, should be equal to 0. So essentially, any number I put in here, if I provide the mod operator and it ends up being equal to 0, then I know it's even. If not, then it's not even. So for example, I could do a check like this. I could say 20 mod 2 and check for equality against 0. Because I know if the result of this mod 2 is equal to 0, then I have true, it is an even number. Otherwise, such as 21, odd number, and I do mod 2, set it equal to 0, then that's false. Okay, so let's construct this into a function. That way we can place any number here instead of having to manually type in 20 and 21. We start off with the keyword, the elif. Call your function whatever you want. I will call mine even check. Notice the snake casing here. We have to pass in an argument. I will call the argument number. This is where you have flexibility on what you want to call it. And then what I need to do is inside of this, I need to say the number mod 2 equals 0. And so what this is going to do is if I say something like result is equal to number mod 2 equals 0, I could return the result, run this, and then I can have even check. And so even check 20. 20 is true because this is true, so the result is true. And then I can say even check on 21 and it returns false. 21 is not even. Now, for beginners, it's really common to separate things out into multiple lines like this. But keep in mind, I don't actually need to save this as a result parameter. Instead, I can directly return number mod 2 is equal to 0. So if I paste that in, this is actually the exact same thing. So if I run this again, I get the same results. So again, it's really common for beginners to kind of duplicate lines when really you can just return something that is the Boolean check. So we have a function that can check if a single number is even, and then it returns back a Boolean, true or false, whether or not it's even. Let's go ahead and check inside of a list. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to start off a new function, and this function is going to return true if any number is even inside a list. Okay, so again, there just has to be a single even number inside of a list, and the list can be as long as you want, and it's going to return true if that happens to be the case. Otherwise, it will not return anything. So we'll say def, and I will call this now check even list. It takes in a parameter, and now this parameter is going to be assumed to be a list. So we'll say num list. And what I need to do is I need to loop through each number. So we're going to start adding in logic that we already learned about, like a for loop. So I can say the following. For every number in the num list, and recall num list is going to be passed in by the user, I'm going to have another colon here. And notice how now we have different layers of indentation. I have this first one, which is everything inside the function, and now I'm going to have this second one, which is everything inside this for loop. So for number in num list, first let me check if I get a so-called hit on an even number. So if that number, mod 2, is equal to 0, well, I'm technically already done. Since I'm just checking if any number is within a list, then the very first time that I hit an even number, I can pretty much return true. So I will say, whoops, forgot my colon there. If number mod 2 is equal to 0, I'll return true. So note here that I'm going to go through every number in the list, and the very first time I get number mod 2 is equal to 0, then I go ahead and return true. And what I'm going to do is say else, and I'm going to use the pass keyword. And pass just means don't do anything. So let's go ahead and look at the logic here. I pass in this list of numbers. I start going through every number in the number list. If I get an even number by saying if true, then I go ahead and return true here. Else, so let's say this is an odd number, I'm just going to pass. I'm not going to do anything. So notice here, return is actually in the middle of the function. It doesn't always have to go at the end. And in fact, we'll show you in just a second how you can have multiple returns inside of a function. So let's first check that this actually works. I'm going to say check even list, and let's pass in a list that has all odd numbers. Notice nothing is returned. Now let's say check even list that has 2 even numbers in it, and it returns back true. There is an even number there. And let's do a couple of edge cases just to make sure this is working. Let's go ahead and have the first number be even. It returns true. And let's go ahead and have the last number be even. And that also returns true. Okay, so it looks like it's working. So what it's doing is just looping through these numbers until it finds an even one, and then it just breaks out of the function and returns true. And in fact, you can think of this return statement as essentially going to break off the entire function and end the function call. Once you call return, that's it. The function's over. It's not being run anymore. So currently, our function doesn't return anything if there is no even number in the list. Let's say we actually want it to return false. How can we fix this? A super common mistake that a beginner would make is they would simply change else here to return false. However, this is wrong. Why is this wrong? Well, I just mentioned you can think of return as essentially breaking out of this function. So why is it wrong to put return false here when it was correct to put return true? Often beginners make the mistake that all the return statements should have the same level of indentation, but that's actually not true. Because look what's going to happen here. We're going to say for number in number list, and then the very first time that a number is not even, we'll say, okay, in other words, just return false. Essentially saying that this if-else statement is only going to be able to check one number because both conditions will immediately return something. So if I were to actually run this, let's go ahead and run this on, let's say 135. So that returned false correctly, but now let's put in a 2 there. It should return true, but notice it returns false because it's essentially only checking the first number since there's a return call on either condition that the first number has. So that means this return should actually not be here. In fact, where should it be? Well, I want to make sure I've already checked every single number and whether or not it's even by the time I return false. So the return false should actually be in indentation with the for loop here. So what this says is go ahead and complete the entire for loop. If this has completed and we never broke out of the function with this return statement, then go ahead and then return false. So let's go ahead and run this and see if that works. So notice 125 returns true. If I change this to 135, now it correctly returns false. Again, a super common mistake beginners make is they think all the returns have to be indented together. But we can see we really need to focus on the logic of what's happening here. We want to loop through all the numbers first, and we can use these pass statements as placeholders to essentially say don't do anything. And that will be very useful when you have a function that needs or requires multiple return statements. Let's expand this one more level of complexity. Let's imagine that we actually want to return all the even numbers in the list. So I don't just want to say true or false, is there an even number? I actually want to return them. So let's go ahead and start adjusting our check even list. So again, what we want to do here is I want to return all the even numbers in a list. And if there are no even numbers, we'll go ahead and just return an empty list. So what do I need to do here? Well, this code may come in handy, so I'll keep it for now. But what I'm going to do is start off with an empty placeholder list. We'll say even numbers is equal to an empty list. And it's very common at the top of a function call, if you intend on returning something, if you don't have it defined as an argument, that you define it up here as some sort of placeholder. So often you'll have placeholder variables at the top of a function. So here, even numbers is essentially a placeholder for what I eventually will return. And so I'm not going to be returning true or false anymore. What do I actually want to return? I want to return the list of even numbers. So what I'm going to do here is I'll still go for every number in the number list. If I do happen to have an even number, I will append it to my even numbers list. I'll say even numbers dot append, and it's called number here. So I'll copy and paste number. Okay, so again, I'm going through the number list. If I attach an even number, I will append it to my list. Otherwise, I don't want to do anything if it's not even. And then just as before, I want to make sure we've looped through every single number in the number list before I return even numbers. So I'll come back here and say return even numbers. So again, the return here is lined up with the for loop because I want to go through the entire logic of the for loop, and only when there's an even number do I do something. And then I return the even numbers list. Let's go ahead and check this out. I'm going to delete a couple of these. So we'll say check even list. If I say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, I run that, it returns back 2 and 4. Looks like it's working. If I say check even list 1, 3, 5, all odd numbers, I get back an empty list. Okay, that's it for this lecture. Coming up next, we're going to discuss about returning tuples for unpacking with functions. I'll see you there.